Okay. So hi. So thanks to Steve and everybody for the invitation to talk about cannabis. Um, so kind of at the front, as Steve mentioned, we know each other from college, but since then our paths have kind of diverged. And I did a PhD in plant biology, and now I work for a startup in Northern California called LeafWorks. We are predominantly interested in helping the cannabis community understand the genetics of their plants and understand better their identity um, to match and follow their identity across their grow outs. So this talk is talking about cannabis identity. How can genetics help? If you guys are interested in finding out more information about us, all of our social handles, both mine and the company's, are on the title slide. Nope. Maybe. There we go. Okay, so starting with questions to kind of just broadly think about. What is cannabis identity? How consistent is that identity? And then what is the impact of that consistency for consumers or in the medical field patients? So those are kind of like the big three questions we're going to talk about for this talk. And before we get into any of those questions, I kind of wanted to cover some cannabasics. So talking about cannabis biology, cannabis history, and some modern conventions, because as with anything in the present day, you have to know where you're coming from to understand how you got to where you are now. And especially in cannabis, with all of its history, this is very influential on how cannabis is handled today. So we're going to start with some cannabasics, specifically plant biology, which is, I know, what everybody wanted to start today with. But cannabis is an annual plant. So that means it completes its life cycle in 1 year. So this is typically everything you guys see in a garden, everything you see out in a farm field are mostly annual plants. And there are two types of productions. There's outdoor cannabis production, which typically happens once a year. In California, this is predominantly what takes place, especially here in Northern California, the center for diversity of cannabis in the world. And then there's also indoor cannabis production, which can happen anywhere from 2 to 3 times per year, depending on how good you are at growing cannabis and completing that annual life cycle. Everything from seed germination to harvesting yield. So cannabis is also a dioecious plant. So what that means is cannabis has both male and female plants. So very similar to humans, how we have male and female humans, cannabis has male and female plants. Most cultivators only want female plants because the female plant produces the flower or the bud, which is typically what you find in a jar when you go to a dispensary. So most cultivators only want female plants. As soon as you cross a male and a female, the buds start to produce seeds. So if you were a seed propagator, that's what you want. Also, if you're a cultivator, you have to cross a male and a female plant to produce unique genetics. So cannabis is also a wind-pollinated plant. So very basically, it means that the pollen of the male cannabis plants is dispersed by wind. And cannabis pollen is pretty light, so a gentle breeze can blow cannabis pollen pretty far, which means that cannabis genetics, so the identity of a plant, can spread over large areas and potentially be uncontrolled. This really happens when you have large outdoor grows. And you're not careful about how you're wind sheltering your plants, and then the male pollen will kind of get everywhere and create uncontrolled crosses, which is bad for a breeding program and bad for controlling identity. Cannabis, because of its dioecy, it's male and female plants, and because it's wind pollinated, controlled and uncontrolled hybridization of cultivars or strains is super common. And you actually see this reflected in the naming of these plants itself. So for instance, the plant Cannabis, pretty popular, at least here in California, a pretty popular strain, is the combination of both Cannatonic and Tsunami. You also can have like something like Harley Sue, which is the combination of Harlequin and Tsunami. And so you see this hybridization reflected even in the names of these plants, and they will potentially look different to looking very similar to the parents. You can have kind of the whole gambit of what these plants look like, and therefore also their chemical compounds will also potentially be very similar to their parents or potentially very different than their parents. And finally, cannabis can be either seed or clone propagated. So what that really means is that clones produce higher consistency. So you take a mother plant and you take a cutting of that plant, plant it in a pot, and then you have almost an identical copy of the mother. So the genetics, or more specifically, the identity of that plant across clones is very similar versus seeds, which are not going to be that similar. Okay, so moving away from some biology basics, I want to talk about some of the history and the origins of cannabis and kind of how messy it's been across the centuries. So cannabis origins. Cannabis is thought to have a center of origin or domestication along the Tibetan Plateau, specifically near the Hindu Kush region, so that border kind of between India, or at least present-day India and Afghanistan, into Pakistan a little bit. And cannabis itself was absent from the New World until the Age of Exploration, so around the 1500s. So cannabis was only found really in Asia, Africa, and some of the Pacific Islands, and it wasn't found in the Americas at all until explorers started to bring cuttings over. So cannabis cultivation, there's evidence that cannabis has been cultivated by humans for almost 8,500 years. And to kind of put that in perspective a little bit, this is almost the same amount of cultivation that we've seen for major cash crops, such as like food staples, wheat, rice, barley. All of these plants have been cultivated for roughly 8,000 to 9,000 years, and cannabis is right there with them. People have been working with this plant, growing this plant for a very, very long time. Some anecdotes about this. So one of the oldest records of cannabis cultivation is found in the Book of Odes, which is a Chinese book of poetry, dated almost 3,000 years ago. And there's a specific passage in Chinese that talks about the growing of hemp, or cannabis specifically for fiber and rope. In the 1700s, in the English colonies, hemp was predominantly used for cording on ships, so kind of like in the middle of this rope. Every English naval ship had hemp cording, and it was to the point where if you were an English colonist in Virginia, you could actually pay your taxes to the British government by growing hemp and giving hemp to the government. And then in India, the final picture, there is a cultural use of cannabis in a drink called bhang. And it is essentially a milk-based drink that is infused with cannabis, and it is affiliated with religious ceremonies as well as weddings. And that's been going on for centuries. So cannabis kind of spans the globe, and it has this deep-seated history with people and how we use it, both religiously, ceremoniously, recreationally, medicinally. We've used cannabis for a long period of time for a lot of different uses. So kind of taking that concept of this cultivation history, one of the things that's interesting, at least to me and to our company, about cannabis is that when cannabis was starting to be what we call typified, or starting to be documented in a scientific way, it was already a fairly popular and widespread plant. So during the Age of Enlightenment, around the 1500s, a lot of people in Europe were having some free time, and they were starting to invest in the natural world, invest in understanding plants and animals around them. At this point in time, Carl Linnaeus was around, and he created the Linnaean system of taxonomy, which if you went to an American school, you're probably fairly familiar with this, but it spans the globe. It's the way in which scientists or biologists classify species. And you've seen it where you have the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, and everyone knows genus and species. So Linnaeus was the dude in 1753 who published a book that talked about this. And one of the interesting things about Linnaeus was that he, in 1753, talked about cannabis. And the reason this is interesting is because, and actually, oh, can I go to my next slide? So, going back to Linnaeus, so this picture, this black and white photo on the left, is actually Carl Linnaeus's, what we call an herbarium voucher, and I'll cover that in a second. But essentially, it's a plant pressing of cannabis that he found in Sweden. And he pressed it, put it in his very famous book, The Species Plantarum. And there it was. It's actually, this actual specimen is on display, I think at the British Museum in London. But the reason this is important, the reason Linnaeus is important, is he created what are called type specimens or vouchers. And these are essentially gold standard references for what any plant looks like. So for instance, if you were to go into the jungle and discover a new species of plant, or you were a breeder and you were to develop a new cultivar or variety of plant, the first step that you would do is you would go to one of these herbaria, whether it's in the US at the Smithsonian or potentially the British Museum or an herbarium like Kew Gardens or something. And you'd say, I have found or created this new thing, and this is what it looks like. And they would say, okay, let's look at it. Let us compare this new thing to everything else that we've seen previously. And if it doesn't look like anything else that we've seen previously, you have either found or created a new thing. And this is an extremely common practice. These are two photos at the bottom that show different herbaria. So on the bottom right, you see stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of these 2D pressings of plants, leaves, flowers, whatever. And this way people can go in and examine them, and it creates a record of when that plant was created. So this concept of herbaria and vouchering and creating a timestamp or a record of these plants is important. And we're going to come back to it in cannabis because, spoiler alert, in cannabis, this process was skipped over due to prohibition. So kind of going back to Linnaeus, and when he was classifying cannabis specifically, the naming and classification of cannabis is interesting and extremely complicated. So I'm going to start in the top left and then go in increasing date order. So left, right, left, right, left, right. So Linnaeus in 1753 created a voucher specimen, one of these like 2D pressings for Cannabis sativa. And he got that specimen from Sweden. Now, I said earlier, a couple of slides ago, that cannabis originated in the Hindu Kush region between Afghanistan and India. It's not really native to Sweden. So he just found a cannabis plant that was already being cultivated in Sweden at the time and said, this is my example of Cannabis sativa. And at that point in time, it had narrow leaves. It was a narrow leaf plant. So then in 1785, another person came along and went to India and said, I have also found cannabis, but I'm going to call it Cannabis indica instead of Cannabis sativa. And annoyingly, the plants looked fairly similar. So now you have two names for the same type of species. Then somebody else came along almost 200 years later and went to Afghanistan and India and said, I have found a similar plant, but slightly different. This is a broadleaf plant. And I'm going to call the broadleaf plant Cannabis sativa and the narrowleaf plant Cannabis indica. So now we have two names, two plants, but they've now switched names. 1971, somebody switches the names with broadleaf, narrowleaf. 1982, somebody says both broadleaf and narrowleaf are both indica, and this other thing is sativa. And then in 1992, so this is not that long ago, 1992 was when like Aladdin came out. Like there is now a new definition of Cannabis indica and Cannabis sativa based on what these plants look like and where these plants were found. So 1992, everyone said cannabis indica is broadleaf and cannabis sativa is narrowleaf. And that was the definition everybody stuck with for about 20 years. But as you can see, based on this slide alone, over the last 250 years, people have been switching names. People have been affiliating different names with different properties or different physical traits. And that has been very confusing for how people define and understand what they're looking at in cannabis. Something else that adds to this cultivation history is what's called in the black circle, the monsoon marketplace. This is where people were trading plants. There's a hotbed of trade activity in the 17 and 1800s in this area. So you see not only a lot of people talking about cannabis and selling and trading cannabis, but you see pockets of diversity, genetic diversity, moving from one geographic region to another geographic region. So now you're breaking down these isolating, distinguishing genetic factors that distinguish geography, which makes it even more confusing to understand what exactly you're looking at when you look at a cannabis plant. And so the reason I bring all of this up, this biology, the hybridization, the dioecious nature, the wind pollination, cultivation history, trade, fiber, recreational use, and even the nomenclature history, the idea of naming different species, different things, is because all of these things lead to the idea that cannabis biology and human interactions have led to an extremely complicated and dynamic history of this plant. So to put it more basically, historically, cannabis is a confusing hot mess. Now we enter the modern era. We enter Prohibition. So Prohibition really started in the 1970s, at least in this country. And so cannabis prohibition, this is actually a photo of my copy of Reefer Madness, which is a movie made in 1936. And it has these very, we'll say hilarious now, references. Anyway, so cannabis prohibition. So over the 20th century, there were big legal actions against cannabis, or more specifically marijuana, in the United States. And it started in 1934 with the Uniform State Narcotic Act. So this basically said that across all states, cannabis sativa and cannabis indica were narcotics, and it limited the growth and distribution of them. It was still legal to sell, but you needed licensing and you needed approvals, and you had a lot more hoops to jump through. So still possible to buy and sell cannabis, just harder. Then in 1970, Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act. And this was one of the first parts on the war on drugs, which bumped cannabis to a Schedule I narcotic, the same as cocaine or morphine. So cannabis is now extremely difficult to get, and it's classified as a Schedule I drug, which means that there's jail time affiliated with it. And then in 1996, California passed a state law, California Prop 215, which allowed medicinal use of cannabis in the state of California. And then in 2014, Colorado was the first state to make cannabis recreational use legal. So US history of cannabis during the 20th century is really interesting, and I highly recommend that people read up on it because there's like some interesting aspects to it involving prominent figures of the time and their own motives for wanting potentially hemp suppressed in favor of other materials. And if there are questions, we can cover that at the end. So why is prohibition bad? What happened because of prohibition? So some of the basic results of cannabis prohibition. Cannabis cultivation went underground, creating a black market commodity. So you couldn't actually grow cannabis in the light of day. You had to do it in your garage, in your grow tent, up on the hill. And it created a black market commodity where you had to sell the product or sell your plants under the table. And so exclusivity was deemed not by the identity or the brand, but it was rather exclusivity that drives product value. So it wasn't the fact that This is, as a modern example, for those people roughly my age, this is like the equivalent of like a Supreme drop, where there's not a lot of these products out there. And so whenever they do drop, everybody buys them for ridiculously high value. I guess the sneaker market is another version of this, where exclusivity, not necessarily identity or brand, drives product value. Also, you have little to no quality control or checks or balances. So kind of anything goes with these rules because there's no regulation. Consumers have to trust their dealers or their suppliers. You have to just take their word for it that you're buying what you think you're buying. There are no consistent definitions, nor the ability to track cultivars or strains between growers or across borders. So this is really important when you have somebody who visits a grower in California, says, that's a really cool genetic. Do you mind if I take a cutting of that and bring it back to, let's say, Nevada? And as soon as they cross the border, they can completely change the name, change the strain name, call it something else, and trade on a completely different name and make money on a different name, even though the genetics and the identity are the same as that other plant, the one from California. And then this also creates limitations on research and infrastructure to do good science with this plant. So basically up until 2010s, there was only one university in the country that was allowed to do research on cannabis for like 30 years. And all of their research, so it was one university, one team, and even their research was limited to a very small amount of cannabis plants itself. So they didn't even have a huge diversity of genetics or identities to work with. So historically, cannabis is a confusing mess. You layer in the modern era and this black box that is prohibition. And now, today, cannabis is even more of a confusing mess. So when I say big mess, or when we say big mess, what do we actually mean? So as cannabis moves out of prohibition, one of the biggest problems the industry faces is very simply, you don't know what you're buying. When you go to a dispensary, when you go to a nursery, you don't really know what you're buying. And a lot of that, at least in the industry, we call that, it comes down to what's called the naming problem, where you can't necessarily trust the name of what you're being sold. You can't really trust what's on the box of what you're buying. So to kind of illustrate that point as a case study with some actual data that LeafWorks has looked into, going back to the idea of cannabis sativa and cannabis indica, where indica is that broadleaf and sativa is the narrow leaf. And if these names, these taxonomic names, are holding true, if the genetics corresponded to the name, we'd expect to see clear, distinct clusters of dots. So these dots are essentially, every dot is a different sample that we've looked at. We looked at 480 samples across 22,000 SNPs. I don't know if you all know what SNPs are, but essentially they are genetic markers. So across 22,000 genetic markers, and we designated all of these as either indica, sativa, or a hybrid based on leafly.com. And if you guys don't know what leafly.com is, it's essentially like a Wikipedia for cannabis. So again, if these names, if cannabis sativa and cannabis indica were holding true to their taxonomic names, we'd expect their genetics, so where they fall on this plot, to cluster. So we'd expect to see something like this. A bunch of sativas clustering together, a bunch of hybrids in the middle, and a bunch of indicas clustering together. And when we actually look at the data, we find that it's just a cloud. It's a cloud of data, and modern breeding, i.e. this hybridization effect based on wind pollination, as well as the history based on the cultivation history and the trade that's associated with this plant, has decoupled these traits of indica and sativa from their genetics. So what this means is that you can't look at a plant and say, oh, this is a broadleaf plant, therefore it's an indica plant, and associate all traits of indica with that plant because they are no longer coupled together. So in another light, what this really means is that today, if you go talk to somebody in the cannabis industry, indica or sativa now describe user experience, not necessarily what the plant looks like or the chemicals associated with that plant. So clinically, this is pretty important. Traditionally, if you are taking cannabis medicinally that has a relatively equal ratio of THC to CBD, usually you're going to do this for insomnia, chronic pain, or epilepsy. And if you're taking something that has higher THC than CBD content, you're using this for like headaches or nausea or depression. The problem is that you can't affiliate these chemical properties, this equal ratio or greater than ratio of these chemicals, to the actual name of the cannabis plant, because those things, or even the look of the cannabis plant, because those things are now decoupled genetically. So for modern naming, as the cannabis industry steps out of prohibition and we move away from the indica sativa label, people are trying to correct the naming confusion. So, and this is being done mostly on two different fronts. First, by their name, and second, by their chemistry. So we're going to talk about each of them. So even Leafly, which is predominantly one of the major cannabis websites out there that a lot of people visit regularly, going back a slide to this name, by their name or by their chemistry. By name is kind of like this original old school way of classifying these plants. And chemistry is kind of this new way in which people are trying to describe plants based purely on chemistry. So the amount of CBD, THC, or terpenes found in those plants. And Leafly, as an organization that actually looks at these things holistically, has actually switched the way that it described strains on their website. Last year, they used to describe things based purely on name, and it had this indica sativa hybrid designation. Now, when you go to Leafly, their website has completely changed, which means that the way that they are describing these different strains is entirely based on chemistry. So they have these different, colors and circles, all of which represent different chemical compounds, and they are prescribing to this idea that chemistry can define a strain. And we're going to talk about both versions of this and why both could work and why both have problems. So first, talking about just names of cannabis plants. So trusting the source of a name for strain identification can be problematic. One, names are changed. We've seen firsthand and anecdotally at LeafWorks that if a cultivar or a strain is not selling well in either a nursery or a dispensary, the name is just changed so that it sells better. This can be something where you have two similar or even dissimilar strains. One of them is selling well for any number of reasons, and you just take something that's not selling well and put it into a jar of something that is selling well. You can also have fraud along the supply chain. And so what I mean by that is this is a diagram of the cannabis supply chain, kind of like condensed, or at least the major points of it. So kind of to walk you through the cannabis supply chain and how you go from plant growth on the left to a consumer on the right. So you start with clonal mothers or even a nursery to grow your plants. You transition those to a farm if you want to grow them at a larger scale. If you're doing indoor grow, you kind of stick to this bottom left nursery category. You can then do a couple of things. You can send your product to a distributor, and that distributor will sell them to a manufacturer or a product maker or a dispensary. Or you can directly sell to the manufacturer or product maker yourself. And those institutions, manufacturer, product maker, or dispensary, will sell directly to a consumer. So if you're a consumer, you can have direct fraud in your supply chain, where a dispensary or a product maker. So product maker being anything from somebody who makes joints to somebody who makes edibles, manufacturer, somebody who makes tinctures or dabs or something like that. You can have fraud from those points to you, where somebody just changes the name or changes the label. You can also have indirect fraud. So this is where somebody either mislabels something, changes the name of something earlier in the supply chain, and then sells it to you, a product maker, manufacturer, or dispensary, and you propagate that error to the consumer because you don't know any better. So you can have both indirect and direct fraud that affects you as a consumer. Now, there are definitely systems in place to help alleviate these problems. Cannabis has been around long enough and it's worth enough money that people have invested in solutions for this. One of the most prominent ones is a system called Metric. It's used here in California, like a lot. I think it's regulated by the state government that you need to use Metric. Now, what Metric does is it tracks what you're growing along your supply chain. So if you're a farmer and you're growing cannabis, you can say, I am selling this amount of cannabis to a product maker, and that transaction is tracked. One of the problems with Metric is that it only tracks quantity, it doesn't track identity. So it can tell you, I am selling, 20 pounds of something, but it doesn't tell you what that something is. Or at least it doesn't confirm or regulate what that something is. So going back to the other naming convention, chemistry. So a lot of people recently are trying to classify cannabis by just their chemistry and kind of move away from names in general because of all the reasons that it just described. So chemistry in this industry is often equated with cultivar identity. Now, as I'm sure we are all aware, chemistry is extremely complex. A lot of, if we were to actually equate chemistry with cultivar identity, we would need a chemovar, the entire suite of chemicals that are being produced by this plant to then classify its identity based entirely on chemistry. However, most chemical testing labs only test for a handful of cannabinoids and a handful of terpenes. So it's like taking a very, very small snapshot of all the different chemical compounds that this plant is producing. And people kind of know this, right? There's this thing in cannabis called the entourage effect, which is essentially how you feel or how you react or how you respond to recreational or medicinal use of cannabis based on what you're ingesting. And that is a combination of all the chemicals that are being produced, not just a handful. In other herbal medicinal plants, chemistry is not considered, or chemistry is considered a quality metric, not a metric of identity. So cannabis is being treated as both a medicinal plant, but not in terms of its science. So what does this all mean? Why does the naming problem matter? Why do we care? So the naming problem matters because you don't know what you're buying. And if you don't know what you're buying, you as a consumer or you as a patient won't have a consistent user experience. And I want to describe that with kind of two examples. So we all like consistency in our products because we know that if we go into the middle of nowhere, we're going to get what we expect to get. So if I go and I order a caramel macchiato from Tucson and I go out into the middle of nowhere and I go to a Starbucks, I know that if I order another caramel macchiato, it's going to taste pretty damn similar to the one I got in Tucson or anywhere else that caramel macchiatos are sold by Starbucks. So that consistency is something that we want. It's something that we like. As an example of what's happening in cannabis, one of the best ways I can describe this is if you buy a bottle of Advil and you open it, you're expecting a bottle of Advil, right? All the properties associated with Advil. But if the equivalent that we see in cannabis is you open a bottle of Advil and you find Advil, you find ibuprofen, you find Tylenol, you find things that you find, things that are not even relevant, like cough drops. You can find extremely potent things like Vicodin, and it's all in the bottle or in the label of Advil. And you would have no idea when you go to the store that you're buying this bottle of Advil that you're getting such a crazy concoction of different things. And your consistency, your user experience is going to be different every single time you interact with that product. And because of these concerns, the industry at large is turning towards genetic testing for increased confidence in strain identity. So people really want to know not only how much of what they're buying, but also what they are actually buying. So I want to use kind of like an example to look at how bad the naming problem actually is. So basically, this is what we did at LeafWorks. We did a network analysis of dispensary samples. So, and we created what's called a network. So every circle is a different sample. Every line connecting two circles together show that there is similarity between those two circles or those two samples genetically. The thicker the line, the greater the similarity. If there's no line, that means that those things are not really connected. And this data was gathered from 50 plus dispensary samples, 10 plus dispensaries across multiple states. So if the naming problem wasn't a problem, we'd expect to see cultivars or strains with the same name clustered together on this network diagram. We'd expect them to have similar genetic relationships. And we actually do see this. There are some nodes of the same cultivar that are connected. So for instance, these two blue ones, Blue Hanes, we have some LA Confidentials, Freight Trains, Cherry Pies. Of the samples with the same name, we do see them actually clustering, which is great. This is what we'd like to see. There are strains that should be connected, but are not. So for instance, we have these two light blues that are Blue Dream samples that have no genetic similarity between them. We also have two purple ones, in this case, Granddaddy Purples here in the center, that are connected via a strong line, but there's a third Granddaddy Purple that's out here by its lonesome. We also have examples of Sour Diesel that are not connected to each other. So if you noticed, there's a lot of nodes that connect cultivars of different names to each other. So every red line indicates mislabeling, or at the very least, two cultivars that do not share the same name that are genetically similar. And this is most of the connections fall into this category. So overall, what does this mean? Essentially, it means that names don't have biological consistency. And we've talked about this throughout the entire talk, that naming can be changed. And it definitely reflects in these dispensary samples. However, dispensaries are not only to blame. This is a common and ubiquitous problem. In dispensaries itself, hype can often drive demand for a particular cultivar, which can lead to fraudulent sales. But this issue isn't unique to dispensaries. We've also did the same analysis at the nursery level, testing nursery level propagules from farmers who want to purchase them, grow them on their farm, and then sell them to dispensaries. And we've seen the same level of mislabeling. We've also seen the same level of mislabeling when it comes to manufacturing. So you can often see fraud where people will create keef or create joints where they're taking in cannabis and they'll cut it. They'll add something that's selling really well and they'll cut half of it with something that's selling not really well. And you necessarily can't tell, or you have no way to identify this short of genetics. So kind of what is a solution to this massive problem that is hurting the industry right now? So one of the ways kind of goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the talk, which are these voucher specimens, this idea of an herbarium and setting up gold standards. So LeafWorks, we are partnering with the world's only cannabis herbarium called the Candor Herbarium to create high quality trusted material. We work with the community to actually make these voucher specimens. So these are actual plants that Candor has gone out and collected from the community, pressed them, and have started to create this record of cultivation, starting to document what is being grown, what it looks like, who has it, and then we can start to compare these information across all the different growers. And LeafWorks is working on what we call a cultivar registration project or a cultivar registration test. So in partnership with the herbarium, we generate these different vouchers to document cannabis diversity, vet the definitions, and then timestamp the strain name in coordination with who's growing it. So what this does is it creates a tangible, immutable record of a sample, which increases the veracity of that sample. So this is how it's done in all other plants. And this allows you to say this data point of this genetic relationship going back to something in these nodes. So for instance, one of these circles, one of these data points, would actually correspond to one of these immutable records, and that can be traced back to an actual plant rather than just being a data point. So this is kind of the broad strokes, but what does that mean in terms of this network? How can this actually be a solution? So bringing back this network, we again see that there are nodes that should be connected but are not. Again, these two granddaddy purples are connected, but this third one isn't, and these two blue dreams are not connected. So what we did for this analysis was we started to layer on vetted or voucher specimens as indicated by these squares. And when we look at the genetic relationships between the vetted material, these vouchered materials, and the dispensary material, we see that a lot of times they do actually genetically correspond strongly to the name. So these two granddaddy purple dispensary samples correspond strongly genetically to these four vetted granddaddy purple samples. So giving us confidence that these are in fact granddaddy purple. Same for this blue dream, same for these sour diesels. So now for the eagle-eyed people, you notice there's a blue here and a purple here that are not connected to anything. And when we actually look at these samples and correlate them to the vetted material, we actually find that they have a strong genetic relationship. This blue one has a strong genetic relationship with these granddaddy purples and vice versa for this sample. So this is a clear example of mislabeling. And not only do we know that it's mislabeled, we know what it actually should be. And so this is kind of like a snapshot of how the industry can move forward to address the naming problem. By using documented voucher specimens and genetic variation, you can verify what you're buying, selling, and consuming. And to kind of summarize, the biology, cultivation history, and naming history of cannabis makes it fun. Like honestly, it's a pretty awesome plant to work on, but also a chaotic mess to investigate. Prohibition only adds more and more levels of complexity. Also the fact that cannabis is constantly being regulated and laws are coming out. So there's a constant moving target with what flies and what doesn't fly with cannabis. The naming problem is widespread in cannabis, but people are working on it. And one of the first steps to solving the naming problem is to work with the cannabis community and establish naming conventions and definitions so that everyone knows what we're working with, so that everybody can go forward with the same definitions when you buy something at a dispensary. And with that, I'd like to thank Steve and you guys and do any questions.